Behind an unmarked shelf in the rare books room of the John Rylands Library in Manchester sits a 19th century printing of the Sefer HaYashar, the Hebrew Book of the Upright, catalogued among a handful of surviving copies of Moses Samuel's 1840 English translation, the edition that first brought a text the Bible cites twice by name to an English-reading public. The Book of Joshua, chapter 10, verse 13, asks a question that assumes its own answer. Is not this written in the Book of Jasher? 2 Samuel, chapter 1, verse 18, points to it again. Ancient Israel had a text it treated as a known, standing record, and that record does not exist anywhere in your Old Testament. What survived under that name resurfaced centuries later, first printed in Venice in 1625, translated into English by Samuel in 1840. And inside it sits a retelling of the most reproduced scene in the history of Western religious art. The binding of Isaac on the mountain, a scene painted by Caravaggio, by Rembrandt, by 1,000 illustrated children's Bibles, almost every single one of them showing the same thing. A small boy, terrified, pinned beneath his father's knife. Genesis never says that. Genesis never gives Isaac an age at all. And the tradition that fills that silence, preserved independently in rabbinic literature, in the first century writings of Josephus, and in the Book of Jasher itself, gives an answer that turns the most famous image in biblical art into something closer to a fabrication than a depiction. In the next several minutes, you will see exactly what the ancient sources say Isaac's real age was, why 3 unrelated textual traditions all land on the same number without apparently copying from each other, and why the answer, once you actually sit with it, does not just correct a detail. It changes what kind of story you've been reading your entire life. If forbidden biblical history is the kind of thing that gets you, go ahead and subscribe now, because this channel exists to dig up exactly this kind of detail, the ones every other retelling quietly skips. Here's where the story gets complicated before it even gets to Jasher. Genesis chapter 22 opens with God testing Abraham, commanding him to take his son, his only son, Isaac, whom he loves, to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering. The chapter that follows is one of the most tightly written passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. Spare, almost cinematic, 3 days of travel compressed into a single sentence. Father and son walking together. The wood, the fire, the knife. Isaac's one question, where is the lamb? Abraham's answer, God will provide himself the lamb. At no point does the text tell you how old Isaac is. It doesn't tell you if he's a toddler, a teenager, or a grown man with a household of his own. That silence is not an oversight. Genesis is generally careful about ages elsewhere. Abraham is 100 when Isaac is born. The text tells you that directly in chapter 21, verse 5. Whatever reason the text has for withholding Isaac's age at the binding, it isn't because the writer didn't think ages mattered. That silence is exactly the kind of gap ancient interpreters could not leave alone, and the calculation they arrived at does not come from guesswork. It comes from arithmetic buried inside the text itself. The rabbinic chronology known as the Seder Olam Rabbah, traditionally attributed to the 2nd century sage Rabbi Yosei ben Halafta, and treated by later authorities as the foundational timeline for dating events across the entire Hebrew Bible, works the numbers directly from Genesis. Sarah is 90 years old when Isaac is born, stated plainly in Genesis chapter 17, verse 17, and again in chapter 21, verse 2. Sarah dies at the age of 127, stated just as plainly in the opening verse of Genesis chapter 23, the very next chapter after the binding. Subtract 90 from 127 and you get 37. That is the number the Seder Olam Rabbah assigns to Isaac at the time of the Akedah, the binding, and it is not treated as a loose estimate. It is treated as a fixed data point, repeated across centuries of rabbinic commentary. Rashi, writing his 11th century commentary on Genesis, makes the connection explicit at chapter 23, verse 2, citing an older midrashic tradition preserved in Genesis Rabbah that Sarah's death is placed immediately after the account of the binding for a reason. The tradition holds that Sarah received news of what had almost happened to her son on the mountain and the shock of it killed her. Whether or not you accept that specific causal claim, the placement is doing real work in the text as ancient readers understood it. The two events are locked together on the timeline. Isaac's age at the binding and Sarah's age at her death become the same arithmetic problem, and the answer both traditions converge on is 37. Not a child. a man closer in age to the modern midpoint of adult life than to anything resembling the frightened boy standing on every canvas in every museum wing dedicated to this scene. But the rabbinic tradition doesn't stand alone here, and that matters more than it might seem to at first. What follows in the historical record is a second, independent witness, writing in a completely different genre for a completely different audience at a completely different moment. Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian writing for a Roman readership in his Antiquities of the Jews, composed somewhere around 93 or 94 CE, retells the binding of Isaac in Book 1. Josephus is not writing midrash. He is writing what he presents as sober historical narrative, stripped of most of the theological flourishes rabbinic literature adds. And Josephus is explicit that Isaac is not a child at the time of the binding. He describes Isaac as a young man, old enough to understand exactly what is happening, old enough that Josephus has Isaac respond to his father's explanation, not with a child's confusion, but with what Josephus records as willing acceptance of his own fate, going to the altar, in Josephus's own words, cheerfully. That detail is worth sitting with. Josephus, writing decades before the Seder Olam Rabbah reached anything close to its final redacted form, working from a manuscript tradition that predates the rabbinic chronology as we now have it, independently arrives at the same basic picture. Isaac is not a passive child. He is an adult who understands the stakes and consents to them. Two traditions, one rabbinic and legal in character, one historical and written for a Gentile Roman audience, converging on the same essential reframing of the scene without any clear line of direct dependence between them. And this is where Jasher enters, and where the picture stops being a matter of calculated ages and starts being a matter of narrated consent. The account of the binding in the Sefer Hayashar, found in the portion covering the life of Abraham, does something Genesis never does. It slows the scene down and gives it dialogue Genesis never records. Before the ascent up the mountain, the text describes a dispute between Isaac and his half-brother Ishmael, each arguing over which of them holds greater merit before God. Ishmael pointing to his own circumcision at 13 years old, undergone as an adult capable of refusing it. Isaac responding that he would offer his entire body, his very life, if God required it, not merely a piece of flesh remove. In youth, that exchange only makes narrative sense if Isaac is old enough to be making a deliberate, adult theological argument about the relative weight of voluntary sacrifice, not a child too young to grasp the stakes of what he's claiming. Then, once father and son reach the mountain in the Jasher account, the text gives Isaac something Genesis never gives him at all, a direct request. Isaac, understanding fully what is about to happen, asks Abraham to bind his hands and feet tightly, so that in the moment of the knife he will not instinctively flinch or struggle, and in doing so invalidate the offering by turning a willing sacrifice into a forced and blemished one. That is not the language of a terrified boy being overpowered. That is the language of an adult managing the physical mechanics of his own consented death, worried not about escaping, but about performing his own execution correctly. The text describes Isaac stretching out his own neck toward the altar. It is Isaac directing the choreography of the scene as much as Abraham is. Here's what almost never survives into the popular retelling, and it's worth stating plainly because it reframes everything downstream of it. If Isaac is 37, Abraham, who was 100 at Isaac's birth according to Genesis chapter 21, is 137 at the time of the binding. That is not a detail Genesis states outright at this exact scene, but it follows directly from arithmetic the text itself supplies elsewhere, and rabbinic sources make the same calculation explicitly. A man of 137, however vigorous the patriarchal narratives elsewhere describe Abraham as being, is not physically overpowering a man in the prime of his adult strength against that man's will. There is no version of this scene, once you take the ages seriously, in which Isaac is bound to that altar because he could not resist. He is bound to that altar because he chose not to. That single fact does not just add color to the story. It relocates the entire moral center of the narrative. The traditional reading, the one embedded in almost every sermon and every children's Bible illustration, treats the Akedah as a test of Abraham alone, a father's terrifying willingness to obey even at the cost of a passive, innocent child who has no say in what is happening to him. The reading the ages actually support is a test shared by two people, a father willing to offer and a son, independently, fully informed, and physically capable of resistance, willing to be offered. It stops being solely a story about obedience extracted from a helpless dependent. It becomes a story about two generations arriving, separately, at the same act of consent. That distinction did not go unnoticed by later theology, and this is where the stakes of the correct age stop being academic. Rabbinic literature developed an entire concept around this reframed reading, known as Zeket Avot, the merit of the fathers. The idea that the willing, voluntary nature of the Akedah generates a store of spiritual merit that later generations of Israel can draw upon, cited repeatedly in the liturgy for the Jewish New Year, where the binding of Isaac is read aloud specifically because it is remembered as a moment of shared, adult consent between father and son, not an act performed upon an unwilling victim. Early Christian writers picked up the same thread from the opposite direction. Melito of Sardis, writing in the 2nd century, draws an explicit typological line between Isaac carrying the wood for his own sacrifice up the mountain and Jesus carrying his own cross, a parallel that only functions theologically if Isaac is understood as an adult who comprehends and accepts what is happening to him, mirroring an adult who does the same. A silent, uncomprehending toddler carrying sticks up a hill does not support that typology. A grown man voluntarily carrying the wood for his own binding does. The theological weight later tradition placed on this scene, in both Jewish and Christian readings, depends on Isaac's maturity and consent in a way that the popular image of a frightened child quietly erases. So where did the child come from, if virtually every early textual tradition that addresses the question directly says otherwise? The answer sits mostly in the history of religious art rather than in the history of the text itself. Byzantine mosaic cycles depicting the Akedah, some of the earliest surviving visual representations of the scene from the 5th and 6th centuries, already show Isaac rendered at a noticeably smaller scale than Abraham, a common artistic convention of the period for indicating either youth or simple visual hierarchy, with the more important, larger figure being Abraham. That convention hardened over centuries of copying and reinterpretation into an assumption of literal childhood, reinforced later by Western Renaissance and Baroque painters working from Latin translations that, like most Western translations of Genesis, inherited the same silence on Isaac's age that the Hebrew original contains, and filled that silence with the visual assumption already established. In the art they were trained on rather than with the arithmetic sitting in Genesis chapter 23 or the explicit testimony of Josephus. Caravaggio's Sacrifice of Isaac, painted around 1603, shows an unmistakably young Isaac, mouth open in a scream, pinned beneath Abraham's hand. Rembrandt's version from 1635 shows much the same. Neither painter was working from Jasher. Neither was working from the Seder Olam Rabbah. They were working from centuries of accumulated artistic convention, and that convention is what most people today actually mean when they picture this story. An image with no textual foundation in either the Hebrew Bible or the extra-canonical traditions that fill in its gaps. Now, here's where the manuscript trail gets harder to follow. The Cairo Geniza, the storeroom of the Ben Ezra synagogue in Fustat, where worn-out Hebrew manuscripts were deposited rather than destroyed for close to 1,000 years, and whose contents were removed to Cambridge University Library beginning in the 1890s largely through the efforts of Solomon Schechter, contains fragments of midrashic material on the Akedah that scholars working through the Taylor-Schechter Geniza collection have only partially cataloged. A handful of fragments identified within the collection under the general Genesis Rabbah grouping preserve variant phrasings of the Sarah death tradition, some of which, according to notes made by researchers working through the collection in the 1990s, use slightly different numerical language than the version that made it into the standard printed editions of Genesis Rabbah most readers encounter today. Full transcription and publication of every fragment touching this passage has not been completed. The Geniza collection runs to close to 200,000 fragments, and cataloging work on the Agadic and Midrashic material specifically has proceeded more slowly than the halakhic and documentary material scholars have prioritized, which means that somewhere inside a climate-controlled reading room in Cambridge, there may sit additional textual witnesses to exactly how the ancient world calculated and understood Isaac's age at the binding, witnesses that have not yet been fully read. Now, let me be clear. I am not saying Genesis secretly describes a fully realized standoff between two grown men on a mountaintop, staged like a modern legal negotiation over the terms of a willing execution. The Book of Jasher passed through centuries of transmission, compilation, and, in the case of its contested English printing history, at least one outright disputed authorship before reaching the form available today. And the Seder Olam Rabbah is itself a work of rabbinic chronology assembled generations after the events it dates, not a contemporary record. But what the sources converge on, independently across rabbinic law, first-century history, and a text the Bible cites twice by name and never lets you read, is remarkably consistent. Not one of the three earliest traditions that actually commits to an age describes Isaac as a child. All three describe a grown man, capable of resistance, who does not resist. Genesis leaves the age out. Every tradition that fills the silence back in agrees on what kind of person was standing on that mountain, and it was not the boy in the paintings. The copy of Moses Samuel's 1840 translation still sits on its shelf in Manchester, largely undisturbed outside the small circle of scholars who work directly with early modern printings of Jasher. The Geniza fragments touching the Sarah tradition sit partially catalogued in Cambridge, waiting on transcription work that has continued in fits and starts for over a century. The arithmetic in Genesis chapter 23 has sat in plain sight, unhidden, uncensored, printed in every Bible ever bound, for as long as there have been Bibles to print, available to anyone willing to do the subtraction. Josephus has sat on library shelves in Latin, in Greek, in English translation, since before the New Testament canon itself was finalized, describing an Isaac who walks to his own altar with open eyes and, in his words, a willing heart. Nobody suppressed the number 37. Nobody had to. All it took was several centuries of painters filling in a silence the text never asked them to fill, and an image repeated often enough that it replaced the arithmetic in the popular imagination entirely. The mountain is still called Moriah. The wood is still on Isaac's back in every early telling that bothers to say whose back it was on. And in a book the Bible names and never lets you read, a grown man asks his father to tie the knots a little tighter, so that his own hands will not betray him in the one moment his consent was supposed to matter most.